Hello everyone. Today's topic is the Carolingian Renaissance. It's one of my favorite classes to teach all semester. You probably have heard the word Renaissance before, and you probably know that the word Renaissance means rebirth. Usually what is meant is that there is a rebirth of enthusiasm for classical literature and language. There are several moments in medieval history when intellectuals look back to the Romans for inspiration for their own work, and that is also what happens in the late 8th and early 9th century under Charlemagne. I have to talk about Charlemagne's agenda for the intellectual life of his culture. First of all, you need to understand that one of the things that Charlemagne wanted most was for the religious education of his subjects to be improved. So the first thing that he did was to reform monasticism. There were many monasteries inside his territory, some of them working under rules which were not the rule of Saint Benedict. Charlemagne believed the rule of Saint Benedict to be the most worthy of those rules, and he consolidated all the monasteries of his kingdom under the rule of Saint Benedict. Then he began to use monasteries as educational centers. So young boys could go to a place like Fulda or Corbie and get educated to eventually work in the palace. You're going to meet Einhard, Charlemagne's important biographer. When he was a child at Fulda. You might also remember the document that I mentioned to you last time, a document called the Admonitio Generalis of 789. The document argues that the agenda of the church and the agenda of the state should be the same. Charlemagne took that very seriously. So let's look a little bit at the education. Remember, good education makes good Christians. So what Charlemagne was primarily concerned with doing was training priests and monks to deliver accurate religious information to the people that they were over. So this is not an effort to make everybody read and write or to increase the social class of peasants or anything like that. It's simply a religious agenda. That part of the things that Charlemagne particularly wanted to emphasize was the use of Latin as a universal language. So you had to learn to read Latin if you were trying to read and write. You would learn not only how to read Latin, but also how to write it. Charlemagne had a school inside his palace at A to train his administrators after they had, so to speak, graduated from their monastery training. And Einhard was also in the palace school for a while. The person who oversaw all of this was a monk called Alcuin of York. You can see his dates there. Born and educated in England, he had lived almost his entire life in a monastery in York when he was recruited by Charlemagne in 781 to run the palace school. He was not there for the early 9th century because he retired to the monastery at St. Martin of Tours in 796, but he, from 781 to 796, ran the palace school and integrated what Charlemagne wanted with Roman-style education. So what does education look like? If you were going to become a literate person in the Carolingian era, you studied two different types of knowledge. You studied, first of all, linguistic knowledge with something called the trivium, and you can tell by the first couple of letters of trivium that this is going to be a three-part agenda. Grammar, so you're learning to use and understand the Latin language. Logic, which you would use to make arguments and to understand philosophical treatises. And rhetoric, where you would learn to write argumentatively. This was taught mostly by rote, in other words, by repetition and memorization, but also through entertaining little logic problems. And I have a logic problem that we will do in class together. If you succeeded in getting through the trivium and you were now literate in Latin, what they called salteratus, you had enough Latin to read the Book of Psalms, you could go on to the quadrivium, and these are the 4 forms of mathematics that medieval people thought it was important to study. Astronomy, now that is astrology as we would understand it today, looking at the sky in an attempt to learn the future or the meaning of what was happening at the time. Arithmetic, no surprises there, done largely using an abacus. And when they wrote down their letters, Arabic numerals had not yet made it into their system, so they're using Roman numerals, if you can imagine doing complicated math with Roman numerals. Music, which is considered to be a form of mathematics, and geometry, which they get from the Greeks. There were some problems with teaching Frankish children to read and write. They had trouble with the pronunciation because Latin was a foreign language to them. Enough time has passed at this point that the Latin that used to be spoken by the Franks several centuries earlier has now changed and evolved into the French language, and Latin and French are no longer the same language. So one of the stories that comes down from this period is a complaint from the professors that the little boys that they were teaching to read Latin didn't read very well. One of the problems was that there was no H sound in French by this time. If you've ever had any French, you'll remember that the word hotel, for example, is pronounced hôtel, and the word hospital is pronounced hôpital. Hara in Latin means pigsty, and ara in Latin means an altar. So the complaint of the professor was that the children, in attempting to aspirate the H, were talking about the pigsty rather than the altar, talking about laying offerings on the pigsty, for example. Didn't go over very well. The script of Latin was also hard to learn to read. Now, there are some changes in the way that writing is done at this point, which are quite small but quite important. We're going to talk about that in class. This is what's called Caroline minuscule, the type of alphabet that was used in the Carolingian period. When I get you one an example that's a little bit clearer, you will notice that you are able to read it. Even if you don't understand what the words mean, you'll be able to recognize the letters. That's because our alphabet today is directly a descendant of this alphabet invented during the Carolingian period. Okay, that is enough for now. I will see you in class.